Hi, everyone. My name's Sophie. Thank you for coming to this panel. I know we're all in different time zones, and thank you to the conference organizers, if any of them are here, for making it possible for many of us to take part in this conference from across the world. So before I dive into this paper, I must acknowledge that I am living and learning on stolen land. I am not Indigenous. I am of settler ancestry. I live in Cataraqui, Kingston, Ontario, Canada, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations. I learn at the University of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, which is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabeg territory of the Algonquin people. These nations continue to care for these lands despite experiencing the consequences of genocide and assimilation at the hands of the Canadian government, including the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people in Canadian federal prisons today. May we as scholars dedicate ourselves to moving forward in the spirit of partnership, collaboration, and collective liberation with Indigenous nations as we learn together to build anti-colonial and anti-carceral futures. So in this paper, first, this paper is born from a nationwide government-funded project called Feeling the Carceral, which aims to examine the affective geographies of carceral spaces. The data for this article was gleaned from 57 semi-structured interviews with formerly incarcerated people who have material experiences in Canadian federal prisons in 5 provinces. In this paper, we contend that attending to incarcerated people's sensorial experiences illuminates not only how they become sensorially attuned to their carceral environments, but also how they use this knowledge to survive and resist carceral violence. Given the dominance of sight in the sensorial literature, this paper concentrates on exploring non-visual senses of touch, smell, and sound. And participants often described the ways that they use these non-visual senses as ways of developing gut feelings or instincts that would protect them from harm. So for example, as Michael told us, you have to have a third eye and size people up really quickly. It was a game of survival. So attending to the ways that incarcerated people sensorially code the prison demonstrates their intelligence and resourcefulness, and also reveals subtle yet totalizing forms of prison violence that have been previously overlooked. So according to Kate Harity, attunement offers a means of considering how humans interpret, navigate, and deploy their sense-making, the ways social actors feel, respond to, and manipulate social settings. In accounting for these aspects of social behavior, attunement comprises a framework for exploring the relationship between the sensory and emotion as guides for action. Attunement relies on familiarity with the rhythms of that particular environment. In our paper, we suggest that sensorial attunement is particularly profound in closed institutions like prison, where the lack of privacy, institutional control, and surveillance are present characteristics of everyday life. So according to participants, one of the most prominent features of prison spaces was their profound filthiness. For example, John told us, "It's pretty dirty. There was stuff stuck all over the wall, pieces of gum, boogers, and snot. It was gross in there. I just didn't want to be there. It was so dirty. Guys were very sloppy and dirty. Every time you go into your cell, you always have to wash it." Additionally, participants described the tactility of some of the different materials used to produce the objects found within their cells. Sammy said, "What a shithole. It was old, built a long time ago, so it's got multiple layers of paint on the walls, and it's chipped so you can see all the different colors. The tile floor is usually cracked and damaged." And then Canoe told us that the mattresses are almost non-existent. Not everybody gets a pillow either. Guys try to insert their mattresses inside another mattress. There's all kinds of ways that they're trying to make it more comfortable. But I ended up with a lot of physical problems because of the mattress that I had, which it was supposed to be 2 inches thick, but it was only 1 inch thick just because of wear and tear. You're sleeping on a bare metal bunk with no support. The ways in which participants recounted the material details of their prison environments not only spoke to the dilapidation of these sites, but also how the touch and feel of these spaces were important emotional signifiers of the neglect and abandonment they felt throughout their incarceration. In prison, different smells attune prisoners to the goings-on around them. Two of the main smells that marked participants' incarceration experiences were human waste and body odor. Alex said that some of the old guys smelled like shit. They don't like to shower. Anthony said because cell doors have bars on them, you walk by and you could smell when people use the washroom. Everyone was tripping in people's pee. And then Charlie told us that everything smells bad and is just dirty and disgusting. That was my first impression, the smell of urine constantly. Participants' experiences demonstrate how air itself becomes punitive, where living in proximity to others with few opportunities for fresh air can create feelings of suffocation or claustrophobia, frustrating incarcerated people's attempts to create home-like or nesting spaces while incarcerated. The very sense to which one is exposed are part of the disciplinary machinery, attuning incarcerated people to the fact that their punishment extends and indeed is felt far beyond their physical removal from society. So prisons are highly routinized institutions, evidenced by strict schedules that structure daily life and impact incarcerated people's sonic experiences. Participants' daily routines were often punctuated by loud noises that were described as unforgettable. For Marty, the sounds of the doors opening and closing attuned him to the state of his incarceration more than anything else. He said, you'd hear the various noises of the institution, the clang of the automated doors opening, rin, rin, re, click, and them closing, bang. And they're solid doors, they're not bars. And they just clank open, clank, 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 clank. It's new still, but it's so final. You hear them on that long range as you're walking, and then you hear the doors close behind you, clank, and you say, holy fuck, that's it. I'm never getting out of here. These echoing sounds attuned participants to the intimidating security features of their carceral environment, which emphasize their isolation. And while the cavernous echoes of sound on stone and concrete intensified some people's feelings of isolation, other participants described a kind of noise canopy that was impossible to escape. John told us that the noise drove him nuts for years. I just hated the noise. And a lot of times I like to go to solitary confinement just to get away from the noise. Listening to everybody yell all day, the sound just echoes in those ranges. Guys trying to talk over top of the TV, and the TV would get louder and louder. It was this constant battle back and forth with the music. It just drove you crazy. The most shocking sonic narrative came from Peter, who described hearing a man in the cell next to him scream in agony after having been doused in flammable liquid and set on fire. The sounds of carceral violence undoubtedly attune prisoners to the risk of victimization in this setting, often leading incarcerated people to turn a blind eye to the dehumanizing violence surrounding them to protect themselves. So Harity also writes that the sensorial attunement in carceral environments is an indispensable tool in the repertoire of order maintenance for those relying on its rhythms for survival. The relationship between attunement and survivability rang true for several participants in our study. For example, Phil told us, you have to watch who you talk to, who you sit with, who you get involved with, and how you talk to people, the questions you ask people, everything you do, because you say the wrong thing, you get stabbed, but you learn with time, you just pay attention. In this section, we discuss how participants use their sensorial knowledge of prison to protect themselves from the violence of incarceration, but also to interrupt or resist institutional attempts to control their behavior. In carceral settings, many of the strategies incarcerated people use to create sensorially safe spaces for themselves are tied to the body, body image, and health. Identifying their own bodies as sites of struggle, participants highlighted the ways in which touch, or the numbing thereof, was an important part of surviving prison. While some participants, like Ace, engaged in extreme methods of physical self-harm, she told us that she would punch the wall and break her hand to distract herself from the sensorial pains of imprisonment. Most participated in sensorial numbing, often via prescription or illicit drugs, to deaden the deleterious effects of their affective environments. When asked how they coped, participants often curtly answered, heroin, drugs, get high. Allison from Grand Valley provided additional context, stating, a lot of the girls share their blister packs, so they'll snort the sleeping pills. Everybody just sleeps all day and all night just to get the days over with. Although the overuse of Prescription psychotropic medication is commonly used by prison staff as a method of controlling and making incarcerated people more docile in Canadian prisons. Participants described self-medicating as providing comfort, dulling the sensorial violence of incarceration, and as subverting institutional attempts to control them. Martin contends that the process of analyzing prison sense is not only a matter of inhaling, smelling, or feeling, but of utilizing air as an analytical lens with which to uncover agentive struggles and competing ideologies in a given time or space. For example, Richard narrated instances when prisoners would repurpose particularly smelly foods to protest being locked in their cells between 22 and 23 hours a day during institutional lockdowns. He told us, lockdowns were no fun. You were fed twice a day out of styrofoam. If it was summer, everybody was throwing their styrofoam meals out the windows. It was piling up and getting a nice stink on because there was no inmates to clean it. We're the ones who work, right? We do the maintenance and the upkeep of the place. It got pretty brutal with all those meals piling up outside the window and coleslaw and things with mayonnaise. What a stench. Remarkably, incarcerated people's subversion of carceral violence resulted from the discovery of alternative meanings in the objects that were demonstratively antithetical to those prescribed by prison authorities. Indeed, in Richard's case, the only solution prison authorities could think of was to end the lockdown and allow prisoners to resume their cleaning duties to eliminate the rotten stench. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. The significance of participants' sonic experiences cannot be overstated, as attentiveness to the sonic ecology of the prison environment helps them avoid harm. As Brian told us, the guys could talk and gather, and when you see that happening, my radar says something's going down tonight. I'm going to stay in and watch the news. I'm not going out to yard. Sure enough, there's an emergency, and guys would be taken out to the hospital. The people I was close to, I try to get a message to them. Don't go out tonight. It's not a good day for yard. Hopefully, I bump into a guy who is going back to the range that my friend was on, and I let him know Brian's staying in tonight. I put it on me. I'm the one that's making a decision to stay in, but my friend knew what that meant. Charlie said, I got jumped in the laundry room. Fortunately for me, I heard something. I just had a bad feeling, and it turned out really poorly for the other guy. In both narratives, sound was integral for producing a gut instinct that violence was imminent. In carceral environments where the architecture is often designed to prohibit incarcerated people from developing a comprehensive visual knowledge of their surroundings, attentiveness to sound becomes an integral mode in which prisoners come to understand the prison's affective atmosphere. This rang true for participants who used their sonic knowledge of prison spaces to survive carceral violence and those who manipulated the sonic environment to resist their constant surveillance. For example,
2 minutes left.
Thank you. For example, Charlie told us, I lived in the bottom of the range and there was a guy on top and he was a lookout. He had a job up there. He was always there. He used to make bird sounds, not whistles, but very distinct sounds that made me think he was alerting someone, whether a guard or someone was coming. And Janet said, there was an almost secret way of speaking because you're always being listened to. People talked really quietly or used hand signals. It was like a secret language. In each of these cases, attention to prison acoustomologies demonstrated the ways in which sound allows for sociality to emerge in conditions that might otherwise prohibit it. Finding new avenues towards sociality was an important part of participants' attempts to survive and alleviate the tightness imposed by the prison environment. So the sensorial dynamics of prison life reveal how resourceful prisoners are in the face of institutional surveillance and carceral power dynamics, but they also encourage us to question the ethics and usefulness of incarceration. By ignoring the sensorial, emotional, and felt aspects of prison life, criminologists and carceral geographers risk eliding much of what incarcerated people describe as some of the most violent, debilitating, and unethical aspects of their imprisonment. Participants' experiences in Canadian federal prisons demonstrate the many ways in which their punishments exceeded their deprivation of liberty and involved considerable sensorial and emotional suffering beyond what was sanctioned by any court of law. Indeed, our sensorial analysis reveals that incarceration continues to be experienced as an art of unbearable sensations in addition to an economy of suspended rights. Without a critical examination of these sensations from the perspectives of those who experience them, we may never be able to fully understand, ameliorate, or end the violence of incarceration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this presentation. There will be now 5 minutes questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or just open your microphone. Yeah, we are not so much. So are there any questions? Yes, Carly?
Hi, Sophie. Thank you. That was fascinating. It was really great to sort of, have all of that data as well, because it's so rich. I just wanted you to say a bit more about your methods and whether you are using different types of methods that get to that sort of sensorial experience, or whether you're looking for this in interviews. And
yeah, so because it was part of a broader like nationally funded project, we just did like en masse interviews about the emotional geographies of prison, and then we underwent thematic analysis and pulled out different themes. So the sensorial politics was one of the themes that we discovered, and then we coded again based on that theme, the senses and that kind of thing. Did that answer your question?
yes, yeah, thank you.
Rachel, you wanted to ask a question too? Oh, I thought I saw you raise your hand.
You did.
Yes,
Sorry,
okay.
I was unmuting. Just took a while. I'm obviously not great with tech today. Thank you very much for that, Sophie. Yeah, I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and it just really echoes a lot of the work that we've been doing on Holloway Prison. I think the kind of attention to the senses and how women really experienced the space in such an embodied way, like maps really beautifully onto what you said. And I was just wondering about I suppose the relationship between the common sense that you use in the title and then this gut instinct, third eye, like how we could distinguish between those two kind of frameworks of understanding, or are they the same thing?
Yeah, I guess we use that quote in the title as kind of a play on words, like what is common sense to people in prison is not common sense to us, but they used their senses to create that common sense. Most people described how when they first came into prison, they were super overwhelmed sensorially by everything that was going on. But a lot of people just said, well, you need to pay attention. You just watch, you listen. And at first we couldn't make sense of that. What do you mean you just know the rules? Like, how do you just know coming in? But because they were under such extreme stress and the threat of violence constantly, they had to employ their senses in ways that people who have never been in prison or who have not been in detention of that kind don't normally use.
I was wondering, Sophie, do you have any information from the inmates about the way these experiences change the way they perceive the world when they go outside of the prison? So did it change their relationship with their environment on the long term, even after they were released?
Yeah, definitely. For a lot of people, it did. And it also depended on how much support they had from their family when they came out. So if they could immediately surround themselves with their old life, for lack of a better phrase, then they were able to deinstitutionalize themselves a lot better. But if someone is in prison, we talked to some people who are in prison for 40 plus years, and the world has changed like irrevocably. So, and most of the people that they knew had passed on, so they were completely alone. in those cases, they were so used to their common sense, to the common sense of incarceration, that even just bumping into someone on the street, if you bump into someone in prison, there will be a fight, a physical altercation. If you bump into someone on the street, that's something that happens every day. Or if you hear whistling is not something that you normally will hear in prison, because it signals death to prisoners. So if you whistle in prison, you're going to get beat up. But people out here whistle all the time. So one person told us that he had to really like use his self-control the first time he heard someone whistle outside. So it's things that we wouldn't notice, or things that we take for granted.
Okay, thank you. I suggest if there are any more questions to keep them for the final, the end of the session. And I'll now give the word to Ros. Ros Liebeskind, is that? Yeah, okay, thank you. The title of the intervention of the presentation is The Erotics of Abjection and Queer Proto-Abolitionist Formations in Jean Genet, Un Chant d'Amour. You have the word.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my presentation started, and that's lovely stuff. Okay, can everybody see that? Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Ros. I use they, them pronouns. I just want to take a moment to say that today I have the privilege of joining you from Nam or Melbourne, and I want to take time at the start of this presentation to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded, and that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I get started, I'd also like to say that this presentation includes discussion of racism, so please feel free to leave or step back if that's distressing. It's also going to contain images of nudity and explicit discussions of sex throughout. So if that's not your bag, totally understand, but there will be images of nudity, including genitals. So I just want to give everybody fair warning. Okay, and I'm going to get started. So in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing a brief summary and some insights from my research, Queerness as Abolitionist Methodology and the Erotics of Proto-Abolitionist Formations in Jean Genet's and Chant. This work was born out of my desire to engage with the study of visual cultures and with abolitionist ideology and action. So the film and Genet act as the beginnings for this work rather than the center of it. For this reason, I'm going to try not to spend too much time on Genet's extensive and complex biography. Rather, I'm going to focus on Chant and the readings and methodologies for abolition that it can generate. That said, I'm going to do a brief introduction for Genet, because it is important to understanding the work. So Genet, for those who don't know, is a contemporary subcultural icon. He's a member of the queer literary canon from the pre-gay liberation past. He's a criminal and spent his later life as an anti-colonial campaigner. Born in 1910, he spent all of his life experiencing criminalization. As a child, he was incarcerated in borstal homes for petty crimes produced by his need to survive and attempts to escape poverty. At 15, he was sent to the Mincke penal colony, where he was there for 3 years. Throughout his adult life, he continued to have contact with the carceral state, being policed, arrested, surveillanced, and incarcerated for crimes such as theft, sex work, petty crimes, his queerness, and his political pursuits. Contemporarily, Genet is often valorized as a saint of queer history and viewed within a paradigm of the romantic queer alternative, an outlaw, an outsider who frequented the world of French letters. He was a particular subject of fascination for people like Jean-Paul Sartre, who was credited, and Genet is credited for introducing Foucault to the work of the Black Panthers, who influenced him extensively. However, Genet, like many other queer heroes from history, is, to phrase it most generously to him, a highly complex character who throughout his life was engaged in deeply troubling relationships and politics, and a persistent racial fetishist. An examination of his only film in Chant attempts to underline these entanglements rather than extracting what is good and discarding what is bad or disturbing. Approaching Genet's failure as a site of potential and a site from which we can generate critique and further instructive methodologies for queer approaches to prison abolition. I'm going to give a brief summary of Chant because we're not able to watch it. So Chant is a 26-minute long silent black and white film made by Jean Genet, composed of 4 interwoven elements. The primary narrative is set in La Santé prison, Paris, where Genet himself was incarcerated prior to the creation of the film. Within the prison, the film follows 3 characters: a prison guard whose identity remains unknown, an older Tunisian prisoner who is played by a man known as Bravo, and drawn from Genet's social circle, and a younger man incarcerated on charges of murder, which we can tell from his tattoos, played by Lucien, Genet's boyfriend at the time. The latter 2 may be thought of the film's romantic leads, as the film charts their attempts to contact each other through the cell wall, while the guard is the antagonist, keeping them apart and disrupting their relationship. The film begins with the guard controlling the prison perimeter and witnessing 2 hands attempting to catch a bouquet of flowers through the windows. Sorry, I've just lost my spot. Following his entrance into the prison, the guard moves through the corridors, voyeuristically spying on the inmates, each of whom is engaged in various forms of undress and masturbation. Throughout this walk through the cells, the guard visits are interspersed with images that we can assume are his homoerotic fantasies. These are composed of highly stylized shots of nude bodies under chiaroscuro lighting. You might notice similarities to this lighting in the work of Robert Mapplethorpe, who was highly influenced by Genet, which is also very interesting when we consider the legacies of queerness and racial fetishism in photography and film. Upon looking into the cells, the guard enters and sees these are 2 romantic leads attempting to contact each other through blowing smoke through the walls. He then intervenes, whipping Bravo and harming him. We then are taken to the 4th fantasy sequence, wherein the 2 men are escaped from the prison in a forest in this sort of like queer romantic pastoral fantasy. We then go back to the prison cell for the final sequence, where the guard places a gun in the mouth of Bravo in an act of faux fellatio. With film then cuts to black, and the guard leaves the prison. And as his back is turned and he's leaving the prison, the flowers are caught swinging, and we kind of remain in this like circular narrative, but with a slightly different ending. And it's got this very open sense that leaves us up to interpretation. So there's a huge amount of this film to cover. So I'm going to essentially analyze one scene, which I think kind of encapsulates a lot of the work that goes on inside the film. So I think, but before that, I'm going to just say, Chant is Genet's only film belonging to his early body of work, which is marked by themes of carcerality. Genet's experience of criminality clearly informed his work, as seen in the parallels between his literature, biography, and film. This is drawn out further in Chant as the cast of performers were kept anonymous for their own safety was taken from his circle of friends and lovers. Genet was unable to commercially release in Chant due to heterosexist censorship. The legacy of heterosexist censorship persists today into the present. What few copies of the film there were struggled to be circulated and even survived, many of them being destroyed. This has impacted the production of research surrounding the film, so there's very little scholarship around it, and my work was impacted also by low quality access and lack of access to surrounding scholarship. And now we're going to talk about abolitionist vision in Chant. So Genet's entangling of queer and criminal bodies with the prison through the deployment of the erotic abject draws the viewer into a queer subjectivity that troubles the normative operations of power in and beyond the prison. Carceral ideology is further undermined by the queer inversion of the carceral processes of disciplinary power. The prison in Chant makes those who enter it more queer, more criminal, and more abject, rather than rendering them docile, normative citizens. This disruption, forged queerly and relationally, troubles the dominance of the prison over the imagination, envisioning ways of being free and being with one another that constitute queer proto-abolitionist formations. In Chant troubles the normative relationship between the prison and the body, where Foucault maps the process of disciplinary power in the prison, enacting violence on the body, containing it, isolating it, surveilling it, and punishing it against those deemed criminal to transform them into normative docile citizens. Since its inception, the prison has been imbued with a sense of transformative power to alter and unobject its inmates. Historically, this has been thought of as a process of positive moral transformation from abject to normative, facilitated by the puring experience of isolation. However, in Chant Genet attempts to inverse this process of disciplinary power, turning the prison into a space of queer transgression. Such a process of queer transgression is illustrated by the relationship between Lucien and Bravo. Lucien begins the film coded as heterosexual and ends the film queered in a transformative or transgression that demonstrates the erotic abjecting function of the prison in Chant by turning the prison into a place of divergent, deviant sex acts and queer pleasure and connection. The morally transformational aspect of carceral ideology is completely undermined. This subversion of the prison is drawn out further by the use of the cell wall to mediate intimacy between the prisoners. So I'm gonna, as we can see, like the walls are interacted with throughout, and they are like the mediation point between the two men to the point where the wall almost becomes its own character in the film. So I'm going to analyze a particular scene, beginning with Bravo knocking on and hitting and throwing himself at the cell wall. He caresses and kisses it, attempting to initiate interactions with Lucien. Eliciting his previously rebuffed advances, he pushes a straw through the tiny hole in the wall that we can see here. This act of penetration, combined with previous kissing and caressing of the hole, imbues the prison with an embodied eroticism, further intermeshing the prison and the body as the hole metaphorically takes the form of an anus. As smoke emerges from the straw, this perhaps symbolizes ejaculation or solicits new forms of contact that create an opportunity for bodily connection through the walls of the prison. When Lucien turns away, ignoring the straw, Bravo, dejected, withdraws, eyes brimming with tears. Turning in on himself, Bravo then begins to masturbate, throwing his body against the wall and grinding his erect penis into the plugged hole. However, as Bravo thrusts against the wall, we realize that he is unable to further the small breach of the hole in the prison wall. This may read as an expression of the limitations of an isolated queer body, implying that it needs a partner or partners in order to destabilize the prison. The film cuts away here, returning to Lucien in this, and then we return to Lucien initiating the interaction. I'm going to press play on this clip as I continue to talk, because I think it's important to watch the film where possible. It's only a minute long. This time the men exchange knocks before Lucien proceeds to push a straw through the wall, wrapping his lips around it and waiting as Bravo puffs the smoke through the straw. Slowly, Lucien swallows the smoke and pulls the straw away from the wall, gulping smoke pouring directly from the hole. This exchange is perhaps the erotic climax of the film, demonstrating the possibility created by queer sex and connection to subvert or invert the function of the prison. Touch possesses the propensity to dissolve the boundary production. The penetration of the hole and exchange of the smoke are thus an act of disintegration of carceral space, troubling the power relations that it enforces. The faux fellatio, taken in part that we can see now happening on screen with the straw, establishes a material and metaphorical current that penetrates the two cells, entangling bodies of the prisoners with the prison. The various double entendre deployed in the material of the cells themselves become implicated in queer acts and is transformed into a sexual actor. As summarized by Jane Giles, the cell wall maintains desire which would otherwise be inhibited or lost at orgasm. So it is a boundary that is both hated, punched, marked, and penetrated, and adored, caressed, and kissed. Despite the design of the cell being geared towards containment and isolation, it inhabits Genet's character. Its inhabitants, Genet's characters, resist. While the cell's attempts to transform the men actually transform the cell into a facilitator of pleasure and connection. Therefore, the hole in the wall may be indicative of the potential of early queer abolitionist formations formed laterally across cells between prisoners and beyond. If internal breaches can trouble power relations within the prison, then they may reach beyond the carceral boundary to resist oppressive structures of criminalization and incarceration. The disintegration of the prison boundary is a queer process that alters the operation of normative society. In this way, queerness can be read as a destabilizing force with the potential to trouble carceral ideology and aid the disintegration of the prison. Through these visions of queer transgression as abolitionist methodology become increasingly problematic when we question the extent to which queer utopias can be imagined from inside the prison and who is included in them. While marking and emerging the prison cell and the queer body as other might elicit a reaction of objection, anger, and arousal that temporarily destabilizes the normative operation of the prison, it fails to disentangle itself from and therefore completely undermine carceral ideology. And this is the failure of Chant, which is drawn out by a critical analysis of the role of race in the film. We don't have time to look at another clip, unfortunately, but throughout the film, there is extensive kind of undercurrents of racial fetishism of Bravo, who is played by an Algerian person, and Coco de Mantinkas, who is a Black dancer who plays a scene in the film, who was an acquaintance of Jean Genet. A critical reading of the operations of race in Chant d'Amour not only draws out the limitations of Genet's politics of abject sexual liberation, but also reveals broader issues in queer theoretical approaches to sex, race, and utopianism. When making queerness into an abolitionist methodology, we must understand that queer sexuality is neither exceptional nor radical, and like all desire and sexuality, that is not yet in a utopian context. It is incapable of dissolving the operations of power and often animates and is reanimated by them. Despite efforts to situate Chant d'Amour within a redemptive narrative that surrounds Genet, neither the film nor the director can escape its failings. Like racial fetishism, the prison does not lead to anything outside itself. It cannot be redeemed. The erotic that Genet attempts to weaponize is not a foil to the prison that queer negativity may read it as. Rather, it is entangled with the imperious colonial history of the institution. Though queerness may trouble the prison to an extent, creating minor breaches like the small hole in the wall, when deployed in isolation, it has the potential to continue to nourish networks of violence, and must therefore recognize the interconnections between heterosexism and racial capitalism and work to overthrow all forms of oppression, moving us towards abolition and revolution for everyone. Though, as Jose Esteban Munoz teaches us in Cruising Utopia, failure is not the end, but itself a site for learning and regeneration. Where Chant d'Amour fails, it beseeches new processes of unimagining the prison altogether. This can be seen by the creation of the 2009 film Criminal Queers by Eric A. Stanley and Chris Ivagaras, which expands and solidifies the abolitionist visions of Chant d'Amour, including trans people and people of color. Referring to multiple scenes from Chant d'Amour, Criminal Queers depicts a community of queer and trans people resisting homophobic, transphobic, racist, and classist, a racist prison industrial complex in California. Early in the film, Lucy, an incarcerated Black trans woman who is the heroine of the film, reenacts the swimming bouquet and smoke-blowing scenes from Chant d'Amour. These visual references situate Criminal Queers as the answer to the unfruitful acts of breaching and outreach performed by prisoners in Chant d'Amour, and envision what might have happened after the film fades to black and the flowers are caught. Wherein Chant d'Amour ends unfinished, with everyone remaining incarcerated and only the guard having access released, Criminal Queers ends in the mass liberation of a local prison, accompanied by euphoric punk music.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Vagaris and Stanley expand Genet's vision of erotic liberatory desire and his later project of radical queer coalitions against the systems of racism and incarceration, and how the prison and demonstrate how the prison industrial complex and queer resistance continues. Criminal Queers expands in Chant d'Amour's original breaches of the carceral boundary, as the film asks and aids its audience to imagine a world without prisons. The relationship between Chant d'Amour and Criminal Queers encapsulates Jose Esteban Munoz's thesis on dialectical tension of hope and disappointment in the notion of queer utopia. Though Chant d'Amour fails to envision a queer utopia within the prison due to the insurmountability of its racist, classist, homophobic, and imperialist context, this failure itself is generative, producing works such as Criminal Queers, which draw on what was left undone and failed in Chant d'Amour, consolidating and expanding discourses of radical queer coalitions and prison abolition. So Chant d'Amour wrestles with the carceral ideology and is able to trouble it to an extent through entangling the prison and the queer body and weaponizing abjection to invert the process of disciplinary power. However, its failures are extensive, demonstrating both the limitation of the politics of the erotic abject and queer sexual exceptionism, and the expanse of the project of prison abolition. These failures in themselves create new opportunities for further expansion and development of queer anti-carceral discourses. Failure itself generates invigorated and hopefully improved approaches. Though Chant d'Amour lets us down in many ways, its contributions to queer anti-carceral visual discourses is valuable in the language that it creates for us and the support that it has given us in the process of imagining and encouraging abolitionist futures. Abolitionist futures, like queerness, are horizons that we are constantly moving towards and forging together. The work of troubling carceral ideology taken up in Chant d'Amour remains unfinished and continues to demand the contribution of us all, asking us what might have happened after the flowers are caught. These are the final stills from Criminal Queers, which I think are a really wonderful sort of hopeful way to conclude, or not conclude, but to begin thinking about the legacy of Chant and what queerness in prison, queerness and abolition can offer to us in imagining and creating a world without prisons. Stop share.
Thank you very much, Ros. So we have 5 minutes for questions. Anyone?
Sorry, I feel like I really...
Yes, Rachel.
I mean, it was quick, Ros.
Sorry, I'm so slow. I thought I was going
It was
really,
really quick.
so tired.
I feel like even though I'm at 11 o'clock in the morning, I'm still like...
Well, sorry, folks. I was like, oh, I'm going really, I felt so sluggish that I sped it up a bit. I hope that was understandable for everybody.
It was terrific. It was really terrific. And I suppose I'm trying to formulate a question, but I was just thinking about the generosity of your reading of the limitations of the film is really incredible. And I really love that idea of the kind of, just thinking about where it can be picked up in the present and kind of reading it as a piece that's kind of unfinished, I suppose.
It took me quite a long time to come to that conclusion. I think I spent a lot of time studying the film, and to begin with, I was like, this is really fucked up and I'm really angry at it in a lot of ways. And I think those feelings haven't gone away. The film is really racist, and Genet himself is a really kind of like disturbing person to study. And the more I studied him, the harder I found having to come back to him and learn more about, like his like relationships with men 25 years younger than him, and his like really racist writings, but also the kind of like weird position he occupies in queer culture, where people are like, oh yeah, Jean Genet, like anti-racist queer icon, and it's like, well, no. And it's important to trouble that. And I think at the same time, what really helped me learn more about the film and kind of understand the film was seeing how other people had responded to it, and seeing it's really there are lots of other examples of its influence on queer visual culture and queer contemporary art, and seeing the kind of power that visual language has established for queer folks to map what queerness can do in prison abolition, and the way that I think I'm rambling, but I think I worry that the generosity of the reading, or perhaps the open-endedness of the reading, is mistaken for excuses for the racist aspects of the film, which I don't want to be the case, because that's not what that work is trying to do.
Okay, thank you, Ros. I see that you're still really awake. That's a good news, because you feared to be too tired to answer the question. But when I see the speed of your discourse, I think that you drank a lot of coffee, or you.
I only had 1 cup, and it was at 10 o'clock this morning, believe it or not.
But that's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe a little bit later in the general debate, we'd like to know a little bit more about your research context, in which, what's your trajectory, your research trajectory, within which this particular film takes place as an object gaining your specific interests. So, but we'll have time to discuss more, because I have no news about Erin Power. So I think that we will only have 3 presentations this today or tonight for some of you. So I'll give the word to Rachel Seoighe. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. And Carly Guest. The title of the presentation is Wounded Storytellers, the Potential of Creative Methods in Facilitating Women's Return to Holloway Prison. So I give you the floor.
Thank you, Christophe. I'll just get this up in presenter mode. Yeah, that look okay?
Great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Rachel Seoighe, Irish name, impossible to pronounce, but thank you for trying. So I'll get us started by offering some explanation of this Holloway project that Carly and I are here to discuss, and the evaluation approach that we took with the project. And then I'll hand over to Carly to explain the methods that we used and to introduce this notion of wounded storytellers, which we've been using to help frame our analysis of some of the themes that have been emerging. And with each of these themes, we want to talk about why these slow kind of creative methods that we've used were an insightful way of seeing and drawing out women's experiences of the Holloway project, and to kind of further understand their encounter with the space and also the memories that came up for them within the prison. So the Power Play Productions project, which is just called Holloway, all in capitals, is a forum theatre and documentary project aiming to support participants, which was 6 women with imprisonment, experience of imprisonment in Holloway, to deeply explore memories of imprisonment and to work together to envisage reform of the women's criminal justice system. The project also hopes to facilitate the women's healing, so by facilitating their return to the prison before it's demolished, which has begun now, the demolition of the prison. It was hoped that the women could gain closure and tell their stories in a connecting and cathartic way. So following a feminist and user-focused evaluation approach, we engage consistently with Power Play throughout the project, considering their evaluation needs and the needs of other intended users, including other arts organisations who might intend to work with women with experience of trauma, particularly those with experience of trauma emerging from the criminal justice system. And a key aim of feminist evaluation is to advocate for social change, and we see this evaluation as contributing to changing narratives around women in prison and critically engaging with the place and practice of punishment and imprisonment in society. Our evaluation is also guided by a concern with emotion as a source of knowledge and an interest in what we call in our work abolitionist affect. So an emotional engagement with and response to dominant carceral logics, which is framed by and productive of abolitionist principles. Now I'll hand over to Carly.
So to conduct the evaluation of the Power Play documentary process, we are drawing on a range of different insights into every stage of the development. So the preparatory stages, the filming process. So we've been using workshops, we've been looking at the rushes of the workshops and the walkabouts and the interviews, and analysing the documents that Power Play put together in the build up to the project, as well as running an art workshop that was facilitated by the graphic novelist Una, with some of the women to produce a booklet of artwork that just pulls out some of the themes that are coming through in the workshops. What we're thinking about today more specifically is our viewing of the rushes. So we were just given all of the rushes. I think there were like 10 days worth of filming, and we were able to view all of these and make really close and careful notes. So that's what we're focusing on today. So we're using this concept of the wounded storyteller, which comes from Arthur Frank's book of the same title, published in 1995. Frank was writing specifically about, after his own experience of a heart attack, and he was writing about illness stories and how people who have experienced serious illness are compelled to tell stories. But Frank suggests that there is a need for people to tell their illness stories in order to construct new maps and perceptions of their relationship to the world. That these stories are embodied stories, so they're not just stories about the body, but they're told through the body. And that they're always told within a social context. So social context kind of makes some stories more possible to get told or get listened to. So we've been using this idea of the wounded storyteller and thinking about how it applies to women's stories of trauma and the ways in which this trauma is held in and told through the body. We wanted to, in this process, this evaluation process, listen carefully to how stories were told through the body. And as Frank says here, he writes, actually hearing traces of the body in the story is not easy. Observing what stories say about the body is a familiar sort of listening. Describing stories as told through the body requires another level of attention. And this is the kind of attention that we've been trying to give in this process. And Rachel's going to talk in more detail about why pacing is so important to that aspect of our work. And there's also obvious echoes of Anastasia Chamberlain's work here on embodiment and women's experiences of prison, and also I think really nicely kind of connects to the papers that we've already heard today. So Frank talks particularly about the need to tell stories for remapping spaces and reconstructing and creating new perceptions of a relationship to the world following the experience of serious illness. And in the workshops, so there was a therapist that was part of the workshops that the women were taking part in, and the emphasis on the body, or the centrality of the body to the stories that they were telling, was evident throughout, but particularly through these couple of quotes here from the therapist, where she says, "We will listen to our bodies and talk into that. There are wordless stories in our bodies." So the centrality of the body to the women's stories is highlighted by the project therapists during the workshops. And this was coupled with a real attention to the women's embodied experiences of returning. So things like breathing exercises were integrated into every aspect of their return that paid attention to the importance and centrality of the women's bodies in their experience of return. And this really created a space for the women to pay attention to their bodies, to the stories they were telling as they moved around the space. So all of the women, either individually or in pairs, walked around the building, the empty building of Holloway, when they returned, and they were given as much time and space as was possible with the restraints of filming to return to different parts of the building that they wanted to see. And it was here in sort of viewing the film of the women walking around the building that the notion of the wounded storytellers and Frank's discussion of the embodiment of storytelling became particularly apparent. So this quote from Jara, one of the women returning to Holloway, is a really intense and visceral expression of her experience of the return, where her feelings of her time in Holloway came flooding back through her body. So she says here, "It reminds me of how powerless I felt. I could feel my chest really tight. All these feelings came flooding back. I was going to burst into tears." But she also talks about how this experience of walking around Holloway allowed her to tell a new story. So she says, in the past couple of days, we've been coming back. It's helped me ease some of these feelings and learn to tell a new story. So this embodied experience of the return also allowed for these new stories to be told. And through watching the rushes so closely, we were able to see the pauses and the deep breaths and the different energies and anxieties and the whole range of emotions that the women brought to that experience, and how those were felt through the body and told particular stories, even if they weren't always vocalized. So I'll pass back to Rachel.
Thank you. So picking up on this idea of pace, I think that watching the rushes in their entirety created for us a really immersive sense of how women experienced and remembered the pace of the prison. So the conversations facilitated by the filming process allowed for an articulation of the sharp contrast between being in the prison for filming and how they experienced the sensory environment and pace of imprisonment when they were actually imprisoned there. So these deeply embodied and intimate layers of experience and memory were verbalized by the women as they moved slowly through the prison, in the walkabouts and through the workshops. And crucially, how they shared these reflections with women who understood, who had also been imprisoned there. The project also needed to respond to the emotional impact that unfolded for the women throughout the process, which was very, very different for each of the women involved. And the pace of the process was essential to creating a trusting foundation for these stories to be told. So this involved many conversations with the directors, the Power Play directors, for months coming up to the filming process itself, making sure that there was a care infrastructure in place, including the therapists that were in conversation with the women ahead of filming and on set throughout. And also in the filming schedule that included activities, games, and lots of breaks that allowed for connection and relationships to flourish between the women. So the filming moved as much as possible within the logistical demands of filming at the women's pace, which was very, very different to their previous experience in that space of the prison. So they talked about when imprisoned in Holloway as feeling very caught in the movement, in the flow and the pace of prison. So Brenda, for example, said that while standing in a particular hallway, she remembered, you can't stay still, you would be moved around. And this area was hectic. You would never have been allowed to stop and talk in the way that they were in the present. And for Jera, the prison felt disorientating, manic, you were always being moved around, and she remembered it as a blur. And again, now standing still in that hallway felt weird, and the quiet felt weird, and having a friend as well that she walked around the prison space with was strange too. So in these conversations, the women also reflected on their awareness of being stuck in place and time within the building when imprisoned. So for Brenda, she experienced prison like a slow death, waiting, being in limbo, where the world still moves outside, but you have nothing to do with it. And for Sarah, who grew up in the Holloway area and spoke a lot about the meaning of that for her, she felt calmed by the sirens that she could hear coming through the walls and reminded that she was home. And she was taken aback by how Holloway felt in the present. I didn't think it would be so derelict, emptied of things and overgrown. It's sad, the plants are taking over. It used to be a busy place and the noise is all gone. And another element of pace that we've been thinking about in terms of the process and what we can kind of learn from the methods that we've been using is that, crucially for us, I think taking part in the project for the women seemed to feel like an interruption from everyday life that allowed space for emotional reflection and processing that often isn't afforded to women who are trying to survive and rebuild their lives in the community.
2 minutes left.
Tamar, thank you. So for Tamar, she said that some of us don't have time to process, we don't have time to build ourselves. There were moments during the filming, as Carly had said, when women needed to pause, breathe and gather themselves. And one such moment on the very first day when the women were being brought into the prison made Mandy think of women who in and out, in and out, in and out are not able to have that space because it's so traumatic out there to even ground themselves. They're always off and running. You just got to get on with it. So we're thinking about this process of return to the prison, to their past selves and selves, as echoing the initial pause that came with imprisonment. And that pause often came with insights into past hurt and trauma. So imprisonment for Aaliyah, particularly the quiet of the Seoighe unit, alone with her demons, created time and space to reflect that she didn't have outside. You can see the quote there from her. So in prison, the first time, she began to see how those hurts shaped the way that she lived. And in the workshops, the women explored how prison was just one system that had abused, neglected and abandoned them, as well as the care system, social services, the police and the family. So this slow, immersive method allowed us to see that the filming process echoed that moment of pause that came with imprisonment, which was very painful for a lot of the women. And watching the rushes in their entirety meant that we could be attentive to how women participated, what was said, body language, and their emotional reactions and encounters with the space. Okay, Carly.
Another thing that really came out when reading the rushes,
You've talked 15 minutes, so now you're talking on the 5 minutes of questions about your specific presentation. So it's up to you.
Okay.
Feel free to go further, but
I'll very quickly summarize these last two slides and I'll leave out the conclusion. So the women encountered ghosts of their former selves, of women that had suffered and died in prison before them as they were walking round the building. So they had lots of conversations about parts of the building that were haunted. And we can see on the quote on the next slide that for Brenda, it was really important for her to go back and collect her 21-year-old self, who she said had basically died in these cells. But we thought about this in relation to Avery Gordon's theory of haunting, which posits that ghosts of the past say something in the present. They're active in how we understand and navigate the world. And the ghosts that we're encountering here can tell us about the pains of imprisonment, or alerting to us to the pains of imprisonment that can't be ignored and asking us to do something. So Brenda here is saying she wants to be the voice of women who can't be here with us. And this walk around was also really important for reclaiming power in a space that the women were once powerless. So if we skip on to the next set of quotes, I'll just quickly highlight this. The process was an opportunity to occupy a space that once so severely restricted the women's freedom in different ways. Tamar here says that she's amazed that she can just walk around freely. She has her own freedom. No one can tell her what to do. And that was a really incredible experience for her. The building being taken over by nature was a really powerful metaphor that Jera identified about how these institutions that are built, she says, are temporary. We don't have to have prisons. They can crack and crumble and maybe we can pull them down. And finally, the building became a kind of one of the actors in the process. So it was something that the women, just by entering it, occupying it and looking it in the eye, experienced as an act of courage. So Mandy here says it takes courage to speak out. We're courageous women just by sitting in this circle. So what we see as evaluators of the process, I suppose, is being our role is to listen to and witness this act of courage and document and share it. We're thinking about writing the evaluation report. A project that's something that's intended to shape practice for similar projects. And to Power Play, we really feel have developed a blueprint for trauma-informed practice that demonstrates the capacity of the arts to intervene in and challenge the practice of imprisonment. But central to this is the power of the women's stories in making that change and creating, as Rachel mentioned before, this abolitionist affect in the viewers. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. So now time for some questions about this presentation. Anyone?
I have a question.
Please do.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was so cool. Just for context for my question, I live in Kingston and this is the prison capital of Canada. We have 7 prisons here. And 2 of them, so in addition to those 7, we have 2 decommissioned prisons as well. And one of them is the prison for women, which was the only federal prison for women in Canada for almost a century. And recently the land in the building was bought by developers and they're turning the prison into condos, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. But a lot of the women who still live in Kingston, who were at P4W, the prison for women, there's just been this like overwhelming outcry of like so many women died and were harmed in that space. There's a lack of closure, and it speaks to what you were talking about. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how this project even came to be. Like how did you get all of these moving pieces together to be able to do this work?
Do you want to speak, Rachel, or shall I? So in terms of the, sorry, Rachel, go, you go on.
I was just going to say that you go, but yeah, it's really nice to hear about. Yeah, we've been kind of in conversation a little bit with some of the organizers and academics in your area as well, thinking about like the legacies of P4W in relationship to like the organizing work that's going on around Holloway as well. So yeah, Carly and I have been working on the closure of Holloway since 2016 when the closure was first announced. And we have looked at the closure, I suppose, thinking about the impact on the women in the first place and the politics and the discourses around the closure, which was very much founded in this notion from the UK government saying that it was wanting to close down Victorian prisons that weren't up to scratch. But the prison that they were talking about, Holloway Prison, was entirely rebuilt in the 1980s. So this isn't a Victorian prison, it's quite a modern prison, actually. So we've been kind of approaching the project in terms of thinking about, I suppose, the potential of the closure of the prison as part of, you know, like a prison being closed down is obviously a positive thing. And as kind of, you know, abolitionists, that is something that we're, you know, could be a very hopeful thing in many ways. But the exact same process as what you're describing in Canada has happened here, that there's been this redevelopment of the site, and we're thinking about, well, what is the legacy of that prison, and how do we ensure that women's stories throughout in this next stage, how do we make sure that that prison is honoured, and that the women who were imprisoned there, that their stories are honoured, as well as thinking about, you know, the dispersal of women outside of London to other places in the country, which has made it a lot more difficult for families to visit them. And as Sarah said, you know, in this quote, that she felt really cut off. And over our research in the last few years, we've gotten a sense from a lot of other women as well that there's that sense of being thrown outside the city cuts you off in many ways, not only from the connection with families, but also the sensorial aspect of it, you know, that you're kind of out in the countryside, which for a lot of inner city women is a very strange experience. But I feel like I haven't said anything about actually the moving parts. I don't know, Carly, if you want to speak for a little bit.
I was just going to talk about Power Play specifically. So Polly and Sophie, who are the director and producer of Power Play, did an incredible job in sort of getting access and they had the space for, I think, a week plus kind of preparatory stuff. But it was a lot of work in kind of, there were a lot of gatekeepers around who had access to this empty building, and a lot of, at the same time that Power Play were in there, they were also filming, the prison was being used to film Gangs of London. There were lots of kind of, it was being used by a lot of kind of big budget productions that presumably were able to pay a lot of money to get access. And it was a lot more difficult, I think, for projects like this to get access. And it was really interesting actually going in. I went in one day with Polly, and the kind of just the work of being kind of really chummy with the people who were kind of giving you access and the keys and everything, and keep it. And even though there was this real kind of gatekeeper aspect to it, so a lot of that work was done by them, and we were very lucky to kind of be invited on board to do the evaluation and to kind of get access to the rushes. But it was really interesting to kind of see how the building has been used and thought about since. It's been used for counter-terrorism police training, who have gone in and sort of kicked in lots of the doors, and you kind of walk around and there's loads of mess and like kind of food packets and stuff from different filming productions that have been filmed in there, that are just seeing it as this kind of like building that is it's going to be knocked down. It can just be used as a rubbish dump. Whereas for Polly and Sophie, and obviously the women going in, and for so many people who were so invested in what's happening there, and the legacy of the site, and the kind of ghosts and haunting the souls of all these women who have been through and experienced Holloway, it was really painful to kind of see the building being used in that way. And they thought so much about how to kind of respecting the space was about respecting the lives of the women that have been through that space. And so it was really, really being used in very kind of contradictory ways, I think, that you could just see as you were walking around, and the mess that was that was being left there by various kind of companies. So it was a lot of work, I think, to get in there for Power Play and other kind of other people who were wanting to kind of use it in a respectful way, or re-enter it in a respectful way for this kind of purpose, rather than it being, you know, a good backdrop to filming whatever you're filming for your big budget sort of series about prisons. I don't know, but
Thank you, Rachel and Carly. I suggest we now have half an hour, so I suggest that we freely ask question. I see Ros, I've seen your hand. I'll give you the word in just 1 second. I just have to mention that I've been told that Erin had advised the organizers that she couldn't be here today, but I wasn't advised, so she had made the necessary to excuse herself, as we say in French. So yes, voilà. I think it was important to mention it. Ros, you had a question?
I did. I wanted to speak to Rachel and Carly and what Sophie were talking about with Holloway. So I was gonna mention, similarly to what Rachel then said, like there's a really I think Holloway is kind of still being contested by there's the community organization Reclaim Holloway, which is still campaigning for Holloway to be used for public land for public good. So rather than, because one of the reasons that the community that surrounds Holloway think that the prison was shut down was because it's prime London real estate. Like that land is hugely expensive and can be sold off for a massive profit, to create, similarly to what you were talking about, like luxury housing. I think the current plan that's gone through, or the current plan that's looking to go through, is essentially that there will be luxury housing with like a women's center where actually like women will be sentenced to different prisons around the country, further away from their communities, most likely. I guess I was actually really looking forward to Holloway. The reason I wanted to make it to the end of the session was because for your presentation, Holly and Carly, is because I was part of the reclamation of Holloway, then occupation of Holloway a few years ago. And I think that kind of, it was a really interesting experience to be inside like the visitor center and to be occupying that and experience the sensorial politics of all the sensations of being inside, and but also the kind of the completely different element of being part of a political occupation with a large group of people and being there by choice instead, and sort of thinking about the role that direct action and like community occupations and squatting have played in kind of subverting prison sites, and also like helping offer, I guess, like as you've kind of spoken to as well, like healing trauma in these sites. So we had visits from quite a lot of people who'd been incarcerated at Holloway and people who had family members who'd been incarcerated there, and for them seeing like an organization using it as what we were protesting and kind of like demonstrating could be done as a community center for community healing, for transformation of harm, rather than kind of the abandonment and giving up of these sites, was a really interesting experience. I just like, it's not really a question, I just wanted to have a bit of discussion about it.
Yeah, no,
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah,
I said it's fine. Okay.
We've both been part of Reclaim, and now Beauty Out of Ashes, which is a new community interest company which is working to exactly that. So yeah, what has been kind of awarded on the site, I guess, is a women's floor, which we're working towards this vision of a women's building, which has really been kind of led by women who've had experience of Holloway, and absolutely something that is this real sort of transformative legacy to the site, the occupation of, and it was I think the occupation of the visitor centre just said so much about what a waste of that space. Like you had that space there that could be used for all of these years since Holloway's been closed, and it hasn't been, or it's been used as the kind of reception for the security, or however to kind of let people in and out of the prison. But
and it really speaks to, I think, you know, one of the questions I was going to ask about your presentation, Ros, as well, is thinking about this, like the animation of the walls and the animation of the space and the ways in which we can kind of map out new futures using the space that is provided by the institution, you know, which seems like that was the kind of the queer romance happening through the wall and the kind of like agency that the wall developed in that process. And I think there was a real transformational hope in that occupation. Like I went to a gorgeous singing workshop as part of that, so we probably crossed paths.
We've seen each other. That's so funny. I remember being in that occupation and having kind of like an open meeting, and there were like over 100 people like crammed into the space. But what was really interesting even in that meeting was like the different perspectives on what could be done with the building, and you really saw kind of the grip that the Carceral still had on a lot of people's imagination. So people who maybe had never been to a Sisters Uncut meeting, never encountered prison abolitionism before, were like kind of quite entranced by what this occupation, because it was like kind of weird and not something people had necessarily seen before. I remember someone coming and being like, oh, maybe we should campaign for a plaque. And I was like, you know, some other people in there were like, a plaque, like I like risk getting arrested. So not so you can put a plaque up, like, you know, we've got to think as big as possible. Like this space is so massive. The site of Holloway is so massive, and like not just Holloway, but I think a lot about like the prison sites across the UK that are just huge, and like what else should they and could they be used for? And you know, I think something somebody said in that meeting was like, you've got to think about how big the carceral state is and then think 2 times bigger. Like that's what the work of abolition is doing. It's like creating those new imaginative frameworks and animating those walls and hopefully even like breaking them down.
Yeah, and I think these conversations do really show the grip of that carceral imagination, but actually it very often doesn't take much at all to just have a different perspective, and then this whole kind of like prospect of abolitionist futures is there and just makes so much sense. I thought it was really nice. I think that, and paraphrasing really badly, but you said something in your presentation about kind of how queer futures and abolitionist futures are things that we're constantly moving towards, and they're seeming more and more possible. And I think actually it doesn't, sometimes it just takes something about hearing somebody's story or being in that space, that occupied space or whatever, to kind of just really transform someone's thinking. So there's this huge grip, but actually it can sometimes be released with just a moment or a conversation or seeing something, and that feels really hopeful and exciting, I think.
It does, and I think it's so connected with the carceral. I like to think about Sophie's work as well. You know, that so much of what we've been doing, I suppose, with the work previous to this evaluation has been, you know, thinking about how to invite people into the space in different ways, whether it's through photographs and doing workshops around photographs of the prison, or like thinking about the sensory and our kind of visceral reactions to things that we've seen in the prison. Like, yeah, you know, we did a whole piece about hair in a plug, you know, and thinking about the visceral reaction and the traces of women that are left in a prison space. And like, I think over the course of the campaigning through Reclaim Holloway, I think that tipping point has happened for women and various people who've been involved with the campaign, where, you know, people who were maybe initially looking for a plaque on the site have now become out and out abolitionist, you know, radicals as part of it, because they've seen the cruelty. I think as Sophie kind of like explained through her presentation, like that cruelty in the space, you know, in the cold and in the narrowness of the beds and the smells and the sounds and the things that women were just abandoned to in that space. I don't know, Sophie, if you have anything to say about the kind of like the potential that work can do in terms of like transforming people's ideas of what the prison is and does.
Yeah, I think all of this work is paying attention to emotions and feelings and viscerality and materiality, things that like criminology anyway has sort of like dismissed as being beyond like rational thought, like, and which is especially gendered, right? And we're talking about women in queer politics, which have often been dismissed as being too emotional. So talking about emotions and feelings, and yeah, the sensorial is liberating and questions like the very epistemological roots of a lot of social scientific disciplines. So I think even just thinking about having these conversations is liberating in a way, and the further you go down that road, the more radical, the more liberating it's going to be.
I agree, Sophie. I think that like the emotional and the sensation and feeling is like, actually, to me, it's a really important part of becoming an abolitionist, because on the one hand, you know, you can argue, well, you know, prisons don't work and this is why they don't work, and here are facts about reoffending and why people go to prison, and that's really, really important. But I think it's also important that we need to, like, when we're becoming abolitionists and when we're creating abolitionist communities, you know, we need to connect to and feel and build communities that involve kind of undoing these like networks of violence and disconnection, and, you know, like what makes people feel like they can call the police on their neighbors. And it's more than a lack of empathy, but for a better, like for want of a better phrase, like if you've spent maybe a minute thinking about, well, if I call the police on my neighbor, X, Y, and Z will happen, you wouldn't do it. Or I hope that most people wouldn't do it. So, and I think tuning into the emotionality and the human connection is like what really builds an abolitionist spirit and abolitionist community, is human connection. And it's often something that people argue isn't quantifiable, which is perhaps why my interest is in art and, you know, that like something that feels very emotional and visual culture where people express feeling. Yeah, sorry, I'm like, I'm truly hitting my sleepy wall. Sorry, I hope I'm not just blabbering.
No,
I think that no.
I was gonna say, in addition to that, it's about, yeah, fostering that empathy and that connection between criminalized and non-criminalized people, but it's also about, like, asking these questions also allows us to examine those, examine those emotional investments in like problematic institutions. Like when people call the police on their neighbors, they're reinvesting emotionally in particular institutions that they feel make them safe. And so untangling all of that racism and colonialism and all of those things just in that simple act, like emotions, is one way in which we can sort of re-examine all of that. So yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah, I think it's a way in to, sorry, Rachel. I was just going to say it's a way in to chat to, because I think with that emotion, with that empathy you're getting, if you've not got close enough to these institutions to understand how unsafe they are, then from a distance you can experience them as being the port of call to make you feel safe. So you call the police, or of course we need to send people to prison to protect everybody and keep us safe. But actually I think it's so important to ask people to engage emotionally and to engage emotionally ourselves, because that's the way of understanding that they're not places of safety, they're not keeping it as safe, and it is this way into kind of creating that understanding of what abolitionism is and how these kind of big sort of seemingly like solid impenetrable institutions that we can kind of think we don't understand, but I'm sure I'll put my faith in it because I'm sure it wouldn't be there if it wasn't working. Having that kind of emotional understanding of it, or coming in through emotion, actually gives you a way into challenging and critiquing that, doesn't it? And then seeing that they can crumble down.
I think also thinking about my presentation, the one of the aspects of abolition and emotionality that we haven't talked about, but I think is really important, is the potential joy that's present in abolition as well. I think I've been at the Cost Geography Conference all day here in Melbourne, and we've had some really incredible discussions, but most of them have been about kind of the violence of prison and the harm of prison, which is so important, and the violence of the carceral state and carcerality more broadly. And I think one of the reasons that I really enjoyed doing the research on the film and engaging with that was because I had the time and space to think about like the potential joy that abolition can bring with it, the kind of opening up of like, what does an abolitionist future look like? It looks like so many things, and one of the things it looks like is like, you know, intimacy without stigma and shame, and being able to like truly experience like love and joy in a way that under racial capitalism like we don't yet understand. And I think that's such an amazing thing to kind of sometimes like, that I need to often like take time to reaffirm and remember that like that is also what we're working towards. Like when Mariam Kaba says hope is a discipline, it's a discipline to me that's rooted in like a love of community and a love of the people that you share the world with. That's what being an abolitionist to me. It's about like loving the world and loving each other enough to know that we can live so much better than we do right now. I like see Claire's turned on her camera. I think she might have something to say, so I'm going to be quiet.
No, not at all. I was just chipping into the conversation, but I just really just wanted to affirm that I'm sitting here nodding furiously and then realised I've got my camera off and none of you can see that. I think there's a real point. I kind of just popped it in the chat about the power of community as reparative, particularly in trauma. And I think it's my work and a lot of the conversation in the session that we had beforehand was around kind of trauma manifesting as recurrent suicidality, but that being a group of people that become sort of an underclass or a sort of termed undeserving effectively through failure of society to look after people at the point that they need that support, but that then translating into a point where that neglect switches into carceral control, be that through the police, detaining under mental health legislation as we have in the UK, but also, you know, I've worked in prisons a lot, and the rates of just unbelievable amounts of trauma and neglect. And as I think, sorry, apologies, I came late, but I think Sophie was saying when I came in about number of sort of care leavers and people who have had terrible experiences beforehand and then find themselves in the response that society gives is to use power and control and incarceration, and that really just reinforcing and re-traumatizing. And I think the kind of the conclusion that I drew in my thesis was around, there's a little thread of work around having an always available adult being a way to mitigate some of the harms in childhood. And I think an always available community is then necessary once you've passed childhood markers and you're through to adulthood. The complexities that are there, I think, really need a much more community response, rather than, as you say, Ros, just going, horrible, no, scary, call the police, and that being a response to kind of to keep that distance there. So that's my rambling, because don't have the excuse of having been up all night, but have also tired hitting the wall. So sorry for overtaking that.
Thank you. Are there more reflections or questions? I thought that a common focus in presentations was on the bodies. And I think this is interesting because most of the time we think about prison as a pure building and just an institution, something really organized, but not in an organic way. And I was really interested here in hearing you about what the bodies in this environment can suffer or desire of, and how can you bodily live in such an environment. And I was thinking that in the carceral geographies, we are often too focused on the buildings and on the spaces in themselves, but not on the dialogue between the bodies inside the building and the building itself, and then the practices that can develop in this context. And I think that's also a good way of helping people to understand what prison is, not only in these courses, but also in a daily life. So I wanted just to thank you for these insights that are really helpful to me. So, well, that was just a general reflection, not a question, but yes, just my thoughts now.
Thank you.
I don't know if
I can say something kind of in response to that and what Claire was saying as well. Like, I think this notion of you know, deservingness, you know, and like what response to whether it's mental health crisis or, you know, whatever it is that, you know, people often end up, especially women, end up in prison for. And I think there's something about exploring that relationship between the building, the infrastructure, the daily life of imprisonment, the sensory environment, that can complicate that very simple calculation that people have under carceral logics, where it's just like, you do something wrong, you end up in prison. It's just like, well, the deservingness there could be complicated, I think, or make people think twice if they have a sense of actually how impactful prison can be. And I think especially for traumatized people and neurodivergent people, you know, like Kate Herity talks a lot about how difficult the prison environment is for people who are neurodivergent, because that noise and the kind of sensory overload can just be so much more challenging for people. And of course, trauma responses can be triggered in reaction to noise and banging doors and all of those things. So I think all of this kind of framework offers us a way of thinking about, well, you know, when we consign people to the prison, what are we actually doing to them? And if we could kind of widen up that conversation to people in the general population, I think it has a lot of potential. If it'll go far enough, I don't know, because I think the kind of stigmatizing narratives around people who go to prison or should be sent to prison, I think, are very, very strong. But I think it offers us, like a route in, as Carly said, of thinking about the potential. And yeah, I loved what you said, Ros, as well, about the joy, finding joy in abolition and hope. And I think that's what so much of what we're trying to do with the women's building advocacy, like through Reclaim and through Beauty Out of Ashes as well, is thinking about, well, what, you know, not to use the word alternative to the prison, but like to think about what a genuine other system that is built in care and is trauma informed, and thinking about, you know, recognizing that women and everybody who's sent to prison are often the product of traumatic experiences and poverty, marginalization and all that. And that, you know, building a different kind of infrastructure that allows for support rather than punishment seems like a really urgent thing, and can be a really kind of joyful endeavor as well. It's hopeful world building, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I think I've been really like thinking about what you said, Claire, about having like a constantly available community and the importance of that in terms of like building a world without prisons and what that would look like. And I think that, you know, sites for those constantly available communities, like a women's building in Holloway, where, you know, you could go and you could say, I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z. And because so many of the services, I think, you know, I was speaking to majority of people in a UK context at the moment, like a lot of the services in the United Kingdom, like actually marginalize some of the, like already marginalize some of the people who need that care the most. So people experiencing active addiction are much more likely to be turned away from gendered violence support services. People who are sex workers, trans people, much more likely to be turned away, and racialized women are much less likely to get specialist support. And I think that thinking about like what a constantly available community for everyone would look like is a really integral part of like what we're all talking about, because when we're you know, like you said, about the presence of bodies and how everything that we're doing looks at and connects to the body, I think it's, for me, studying kind of like queerness and the erotics of abolition, it very much felt like it wasn't about the body alone, but about bodies together, and like the kind of like communal body, and what it means to want to connect with other people, and like what that desire to connect can bring and build.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Or this could be our final insight. I don't know. Okay.
A point to end on, but I just to say that I popped the websites for Beauty Out of Ashes and Reclaim Holloway in the chat, because it seems like there's a potential for collaboration or getting involved, whether you're based in the UK or not. We're trying to kind of build capacity, I think, and you know, thinking about having researchers involved in various different ways would be really useful, as well as kind of thinkers and joyful collaborators on the road to a women's building and an abolitionist future.
Okay, thank you. So it's about time. Yeah, it's nearly the end. So I want to thank all of you, the presenters, but also the public. We weren't not so much, but it was really interesting, and that's a point in the end. I'll be online tomorrow with the exploration in carceral geography around the openness of prison, but I hope we'll see each other in one or another session online, because I'm in Belgium. But okay, so see you and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for the sharing, Christophe. Really lovely to meet you all.
Bye everyone.